It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And as always, of course, that means some smart talk radio is in your future. In this segment, I'll tell you what, we've been doing this show now, a couple of decades now, and this is the first for this one. We're going to be talking about cannibalism, a perfectly natural history with none other than Bill Shutt. He's the author and a professor of biology at Long Island University Post. He's also a research associate in residence at the American Museum of Natural History, which is an extraordinary venue if you've ever been there. He also received his PhD in zoology from Cornell and did postdoctorate work at MNH, where he's the recipient of the Theodore Roosevelt Grant. His first book, Dark Bouquet, The Blood and Curious Lives of Blood-Feeding Creatures, was selected as a best book in 2008, and on and on and on. I think you see where we're headed here. Should be a good one, talking about people and things that eat things like them. Bill, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Well, good. You haven't counted them. This is a first for us on cannibalism, but this is probably, again, as we were talking earlier, maybe interview 140 to 150 for you. So we'll make sure this is very. We'll make sure.
Listen, I'm very lucky to be here. I'm just thrilled at the reception that this book has had.
Well, you know what? Here's a question. First of all, cannibalism is sort of, you think about cannibalism. If I think about that, I think, well, my real input's probably been on some cheesy horror movie back in the early 60s. But short of that, why the fascination for you, and why a book on cannibalism specifically for Bill Shutt?
Well, my first book, Dark Banquet, dealt with blood-feeding creatures. And if you back up a few years, I did my PhD at Cornell, and I studied vampire bats. And before that, I'd always been into animals. The stranger, the better. I had a monkey when I was a little kid, and so really nobody's surprised that at the subjects that I've been working on. And after blood feeding, I thought that cannibalism seemed like just a very natural next book for me. So, and it's worked out really well. I like to, as you mentioned, there's a lot of gory, sensationalized stuff out there, and there are also some highly academic books. And I think I found a niche in the middle there where I could go in, cut the jargon out, try to be somewhat entertaining, throw in some humor where appropriate, and certainly there are places where it's not appropriate, and get people thinking about these topics in a way that demystifies them, that puts them into another light. And I'm a zoologist, so I give you that aspect of it. And as a teacher, I try to get the point across without a lot of mumbo jumbo.
What is, and again, if you asked 100 people, tell me about cannibalism, people would probably look at you funny. But what, in your opinion, what is, do we have a big misconception about what cannibalism really is?
Yeah, well, I think this stems from this taboo that we've had for probably well over 2,000 years, starting with Homer and the ancient Greeks, and then moving through the Romans and William Shakespeare and the Brothers Grimm, and on, Sigmund Freud, where there has been this snowball effect, and where cannibalism is now the ultimate taboo. And so that's the knee-jerk reaction that people have to this. They think about Jeffrey Dahmer, they think about these poor guys that were stranded in the Andes back in the 1970s. But there are all sorts of instances across the animal kingdom, for example, that have nothing to do with a shortage of food. And this was where I went in and did the work initially, because the party line-up until fairly recently had been, well, except for a couple of strange animals like, black widow spiders and praying mantises. If you see cannibalism in the animal kingdom, it's going to be weird and probably due to a lack of food or cramped captive conditions. And that just wasn't the case. I found many instances of cannibalism as a form of parental care, as a sexual strategy, as a sort of a lifeboat mechanism that birds would use. So there's all these really neat things out there. And then looking at humans, which I did, I was really surprised to find, for example, how common medicinal cannibalism was throughout Europe for hundreds of years, starting in the Middle Ages and moving through the Renaissance and right up into the 1900s. And I said, well, this is pretty much a complete surprise, given the taboo that we've had that these people did this.
Is there a particular species or genre, for example, mammals versus insects versus birds, for example, that is necessarily predisposed, or you find it more common? Any kind of?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, great question. Certainly, cannibalism in the wild is widespread, but you find it much more commonly in invertebrate creatures like insects. Extremely common. Spiders, snails. Then you move into the vertebrates, and you find that, for the most part, any fish that lays eggs is probably cannibalizing some of those eggs. And so it's very common in egg-laying fish, very common in amphibians like frogs and toads and salamanders. And there was some really, really incredibly cool stories there. These spadefoot toads that I worked with researchers out in Arizona, looking at the fact that these toads, the eggs are laid in they're called them ponds, and when I went out there, they looked more like puddles. And in this environment, these ponds can dry up in a night. Now, if you lay 1,000 eggs in this pond, if you're a toad, and that pond dries up before these tadpoles hatch and form into toadlets and then can kind of crawl off, then everybody's dead. And what occurs is that about half of the eggs, once they hatch into tadpoles, a couple of days in, the tadpoles get huge teeth, big jaw muscles, and they're from the same eggs as these smaller omnivorous tadpoles, and they eat their brethren, and so they develop quicker and they get out of the pond quicker. So it was all sorts of stories like this that I found really intriguing.
So when you think of cannibalism, again, we dial back to those bad black and white movies, and you think of somewhere in some continent far away, there's a person sitting in a boiling pot of water, surrounded by some kind of native people of some kind. But realistically, when we say cannibalism, is there what is the sort of the clinical or classic definition of cannibalism? And I ask because is it? Sometimes you said it was sexual. Sometimes you said it was an aggressive deal. Sometimes it's just a simple means of survival. If a certain kind of fish is eating another fish, is that cannibalism, or is that just nope? I'm just finding protein.
No, I mean, by my definition, and this is not one that I came up with. These are researchers over the years. So, I mean, I would define cannibalism as if you're consuming anything, a body part or the entire animal, and it's in the same species as you're in, that's cannibalism. Whether it's whether the animal is dead and you come across it, or whether you kill it and eat it, or whether you eat a part of it. There were certainly some gray areas there, but that's my definition. And your comment before about the pot and thinking about that, about cannibals and somebody stewing in a pot, that I think is also really interesting. And I found this whole body of work and research that now is looking at the term cannibalism being used as a weapon, in a sense, to subjugate other cultures. So, for example, I've got a long chapter about how when Columbus came to the New World, on his first trip, he described the people that he met as really nice. They were very beautiful people, etc. And he didn't find any gold. And on his next 3 trips to the New World, they were more like invasions, and he had figured out that if he could call these people cannibals, then all bets were off. You didn't have to treat them well. Queen Isabella had said, "Look, if these people are as nice as you say, then you need to treat them with kindness. But if they're cannibals, then you can do whatever you want to them." Well, lo and behold, all of these groups that were thought to be nice, friendly, indigenous types were suddenly labeled as cannibals and then exploited and subjugated and destroyed. And so that mindset of the sort of the other performing these nefarious types of rituals, like cooking people, that's what we think of, and I do think that that sort of stems from this taboo that we have, and it's been used. I guess that's the point I'm making.
If you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck, as always, of Lewis at Large Radio, in the midst of an interesting one with Bill Shutt. He is a professor of biology at Long Island University Post. He's also a research associate in residence at the American Museum of Natural History, a new work called Cannibalism, A Perfectly Natural History. Bill, one of the, I think, misconceptions is that, cannibalism, it doesn't really happen in the West, and particularly not with human beings, but that's not true, is it?
Well, I think the last vestiges of this medicinal cannibalism that I saw across Europe that ended in the early 1900s are people who consume their placentas after giving birth, the idea being that there was some medicinal value to having your placenta prepared for you that would treat maladies like the baby blues, the ups and downs that mothers often experience after they've just given birth. And so I looked up a couple of these people, and one of them actually invited me down to partake in her placenta. She said her husband was a chef, and I just started my semester. I wasn't planning to do any more traveling. I thought maybe I'd get a Skype interview out of her, and she said, "No, that's too bad. Well, why don't you come down? You can eat my placenta. We'll cook it up any way you want it. My husband can make it into tacos, or you can have it ossobuco style." And I started to think to myself, if I'm writing a book about cannibalism and it's 10 years down the road, and I realized that I actually had the chance to go down there and try this, and I didn't do it, then I might be kicking myself years later. So I hopped on a flight, ran down to Texas, and sort of the rest is the rest turned out to be a really interesting story.
What about let's look at it. Let's bring it into sort of modern day culture. Are there laws specifically against eating human parts, dead or alive?
Not necessarily so. There was probably more strict regulations about, say, taking your placenta home after you give birth, because it's treated as medical waste. So you need to have special permission, and there are states where this occurs. But surprisingly, there are not laws out there that are specific for consuming body parts.
Did you, again, as you look across the animal kingdom, is there any reason to think that cannibalism is growing or getting less in the animal kingdom? Or, again, is it just part of the DNA of various types of animals, and they're going to continue to do it? It's just part of it's just inbred in who they are.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of the sensationalized knee-jerk answer to that is comes from these headlines that talk about polar bears now turning to cannibalism because of global climate change. Well, it's a whole lot deeper and more interesting than that sensational headline, because polar bears have been consuming other bears for thousands and thousands of years. Now, the female bears, when they have their cubs, will have historically taken their cubs further inland and away from where the males hunt. Now, is a reduction in this ice causing male bears to move inland into places where they've never encountered females before? Quite possibly, but it's not as simple as the sensational headlines would make you think. So once again, here's a cannibalism-related headline that there's much more to it than appears. But other than that, I think animals are out there doing this for all sorts of reasons, and to me, there's no indication that it's bizarre, that it's strange behavior or abnormal behavior rather, and I can certainly see it continuing. It makes perfect evolutionary sense for many, many reasons.
Right. It would be interesting to see, if denied the opportunity to carry on with cannibalistic rituals, what would happen to certain animal species. It might change the game quite a bit.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and there's no indication that would ever happen. This is, I mean, like I said, this is natural behavior. If you're a male spider, let's say, and you're probably never going to encounter another female spider in your life, then when you, and this certainly isn't all spiders, then when you meet her, then not only do you want to mate with her, but you're going to provide her with a meal that will, one, ensure that she doesn't mate with other males, two, she's healthy, three, she probably produces more eggs and ultimately spreads your genes further than if she hadn't eaten you. So these, there's no indication that this would ever change. This is a highly evolved system, whether it's a lifeboat strategy in birds where eggs are laid asynchronously. You've got eggs of different ages, and when the oldest one hatches, he bosses around everybody else. And if you run out of food, that not only does he boss you around, but he'll kill you and eat you. And this is a strategy that in a sense assures that at least one of the hatchlings will survive. So you see that across nature.
Yeah, Bill, we're talking with Bill Shutt. He's a professor of biology at LIU Post and a research associate in residence at the American Museum of Natural History. The work is Cannibalism, a Perfectly Natural History. First time we've ever really tackled this subject on this show, but pleased to do it right now. Bill, what about, and we kind of touched on it earlier, but the idea that in a civilized society, at least for human beings, cannibalism, doesn't exist, and if it does exist, it shouldn't.
I mean, culture is king. We're taught that cannibalism shouldn't exist. So we have imposed ourselves on a lot of different groups. When anthropologists went into Brazil in the 1970s, and they met this group called the Waray. The Waray were as mortified at the concept of Westerners burying their dead as the Westerners were at the idea that the Waray were consuming their dead loved ones. And their response was along the lines of, how could you put your beloved dead into the ground to rot and be eaten by worms? Why wouldn't you incorporate them into yourselves? That is the civilized thing to do. So it all depends on what your culture dictates. And our culture for the longest time has dictated that cannibalism is a taboo. In other places that didn't get that Western influence, not so much. But, Western culture is now so pervasive around the world that it's, these groups of people who may have done that before, when they encounter the Westerners who are completely hostile about that, they have a tendency to probably either not do it anymore, adjust their behaviors, or hide it and do it in secret. But I really believe that culture is king, and that's a key term in this book.
It doesn't come up often at cocktail parties, but has our attitude about cannibalism, has it changed over the years, or does anyone even lay awake at night worrying about it?
Well, I mean, I hope it does now that people are reading this book and finding out that there are other angles to take when you approach this topic besides the Donner Party and Jeffrey Dahmer. And that's really what I want to do with this book, is to open this up as a topic that can be looked at from a scientific perspective and one that can be readily understood by people. A lot of this stuff makes perfect sense. It's not like I don't have to delve into science fiction to find really interesting, incredibly interesting examples of this.
Bill, is there, as a result of this work, does any of your work run counter maybe to previous thought about cannibalism, either philosophical or just biologically, how the whole system works?
Yeah, great question. I guess that up until recently, the scientific take was that this was not a natural behavior, and a lot of individual scientists working on their own specific, their own favorite critters, came to the conclusion that cannibalism occurred, and it wasn't until recently that I was able to sort of put that together, synthesize it in a form that I want people to know, my readers to know that this is a very common type of behavior.
Well, it is a fascinating subject. A couple more questions. I'm curious as to your colleagues. I would think of anybody that would be a little bit sympathetic and sort of encouraging you on would be your buddies at the American Museum of Natural History, I would think.
Yeah. They're pretty psyched about it. People like that know me already. It's what's really funny is when I'll come across somebody who I haven't talked to in 20, 25 years, and they're like, "Well, what do you do for a living?" I'm like, "Well, I just published a book on. I just had a book published on cannibalism, and that was the one after blood feeding, and I was studying vampire bats for a long time, and nobody is really surprised." So anybody who knows me knows that this is the type of thing that I'm interested in.
What about, and again, how much you did a lot of research, but you traveled and did all kinds of examinations. How much is, or at what depth is this subject of cannibalism being studied? Is it being looked at by more and more people, such as yourself, or is it something that, quite frankly, is kind of just laid on the shelf for decades and decades?
No. I was really surprised when I went to cover the Donner Party. I figured, well, here's the most famous example of cannibalism in the United States, and I said to myself, I'm sure everything's been done on this, and lo and behold, I was completely wrong. There are researchers now who are, I was out with these folks, and they use human historical remains detecting dogs that are able to now pinpoint the location of the various campsites that are associated with the Donners. And so we're using modern techniques to look at, up until recently, for example, there was the numbers, 80% of the females died 80% of the males died in the Donner Party, and 80% of the females survived. And, you look at that up until recently, and you go, well, there's a coincidence. We now know from studying starvation that this is not a coincidence, that it makes sense that the females survived because they had a higher percentage of body fat, they had a lower metabolic rate. When you put them into these incredibly horrible frozen conditions, that the females were going to survive more often than the males. And by the same token, all of the bachelors died. Why? Probably because they didn't have the care of family and had more stress hormones, which caused them to die quicker ultimately. So all of these things are being looked at now in a new light, and across the animal kingdom as well. There are people who are looking at this, as something beyond bizarre behavior nowadays, and that's kind of interesting to me.
Well, again, the work is Cannibalism, A Perfectly Natural History by a perfectly natural guy, Bill Shutt. Again, Bill, thank you for spending some time with us today. How can people not only find out more about the work that you do in this subject, but also maybe pick up a copy of the book?
Sure, the book is everywhere. It's you can buy it anywhere that books are sold. It's an ebook. It's a hardcover right now. There's actually a voice version of it. My website is billshutt.com, and I'm also on Facebook, Bill Shutt Author, and you can find me on Twitter as well. So,
any plans for a movie?
Well, the film rights were purchased actually by a really an excellent documentary filmmaking company in California. But I also have a novel that just came out in paperback. It's called Hell's Gate, and so that's out there. That came out last week. So it's been interesting, and that's a World War II sort of techno thriller that takes place in central Brazil. Okay, well, we'll love to have you back on again, and let's talk about that. But again, thank you so much, and best of luck with the book, and we'll look forward to talking to you again. Thank you very much. It was my pleasure being on the show. You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.